It's officially cap season in the NFL, and while the Miami Dolphins already made early salary cap-related releases to get ahead of the market, the spotlight now turns to the Detroit Lions and what they could possibly do before free agency opens. The reality is simple. The Lions are projected to be over the 2026 salary cap, which is expected to land somewhere between $301 and $306 million. That means adjustments are coming. The new league year begins on March 11th, and Detroit will have to be compliant before that date. The question isn't whether moves will happen. The question is where they happen and how aggressive Brad Holmes decides to be. We already know contract restructures will likely account for most of the maneuvering. That's typically how teams handle tight cap situations without weakening the roster. But today we're talking about something more uncomfortable: potential cap casualties. And when you break down the numbers, there are really three names that stand out as the most significant in terms of potential savings. Let's start with Graham Glasgow. Glasgow carries a current cap hit of $8,437,500. If the Lions were to cut him, they would create $5,562,500 in cap space, while absorbing $2,875,000 in dead cap. That's not insignificant. Now, context matters. Glasgow had a tough season at center last year. He believed he would return to right guard, but instead he filled in for Frank Ragnow. That was always going to be a downgrade. Still, it's fair to say he didn't meet his own expectations at the position. It also didn't help that he was playing between two very young players. Stability matters on the offensive line, and he didn't exactly have it. Now he enters the offseason with the 9th highest cap hit among NFL centers. That's notable, especially when you consider that the Lions are reportedly considering an overhaul along the offensive line. Glasgow still has value. He's versatile, he can play multiple spots. But here's the reality. He will be 34 when the season starts. Paying $8.4 million for a primary reserve is difficult to justify under cap pressure. The Lions could approach him about a pay cut. That's possible, but from the numbers and the situation, it feels like a full release or even retirement is more likely. The likelihood of him being a cap casualty sits around 70%. That's not a small number. Now let's talk about Taylor Decker. Decker's cap hit for 2026 is $21,048,000. If cut, the Lions would create $11,604,000 in cap space, but they would also take on $9,444,000 in dead money. That's a significant swing. On the surface, that $21 million number jumps out. But when you compare it across the league, it's only 12th among all NFL left tackles for 2026. So relative to the position, it's not outrageous. Decker is still playing at an above-average to good level at left tackle. The concern is durability. Injuries have plagued his last few seasons. To his credit, he has played through them, but it has clearly taken a mental toll, and he has openly considered retirement. If he retires, the cap relief mirrors what the Lions would get from cutting him. So would Detroit actually cut him if he wanted to keep playing? It seems unlikely. Given the uncertainty across the rest of the offensive line, removing your starting left tackle voluntarily would create more problems than it solves. The only scenario where a cut makes sense is if he hasn't made a firm decision about his future by the time the Lions need clarity for cap compliance. Even then, it's hard to envision Decker playing in another uniform. If he were cut, retirement feels like the natural outcome. The likelihood of him being a cap casualty, just 10%. And then we arrive at David Montgomery. Montgomery carries a current cap hit of $8,370,833. If released, the Lions would save $3,508,332 while taking on $4,862,501 in dead cap. So the savings are modest compared to the others. But here's where it gets interesting. Brad Holmes opened the door to trade speculation when he suggested the team would be open to moving Montgomery if another team could utilize him more fully. Holmes made it clear he respects Montgomery. He acknowledged that the Lions didn't get as much utilization from him last season as they would have liked. Dan Campbell feels the same way. Holmes even said that if Detroit can't maximize Montgomery's skill set, they would want to see what situation could work best for him. Now look at the trade market reality. Montgomery is 29 years old, and acquiring team would take on a $6 million cap hit that would rank 19th among running backs in 2026. Is there a strong market for that? It's questionable. So if trade offers don't materialize, would Detroit cut him to do right by the player? That's harder to predict. Here's the twist. The Lions have been publicly hyping Montgomery all offseason, and after conversations with new offensive coordinator Drew Petzing, Montgomery seemed more at peace. He even shared that Petzing was very intentional in assuring him that he wants him to be part of the offense moving forward. That matters. It changes the tone of the conversation. Right now, the likelihood of Montgomery being a cap casualty sits at just 5%. That tells you the speculation may be louder outside the building than inside it. Beyond these three names, the only other players who would generate at least $2 million in savings are Sam Laporta, Brian Branch, and Jack Fox. But those scenarios aren't even worth discussing. They're not realistic options. Josh Paschal is another name to mention. He carries a $1,759,863 cap hit, none of which is guaranteed. But there's no urgency there. The Lions can carry him into training camp, evaluate him when healthy, and even if he doesn't make the roster, the team would only absorb $100,000 via a workout bonus. So when you look at the big picture, the Lions don't have massive, easy cuts available. This isn't a roster full of bloated contracts waiting to be slashed. Most of the cap compliance will likely come through restructuring rather than dramatic departures. But if one major move happens, all signs point first toward Glasgow. The bigger question for you as a fan is this: if the Lions need flexibility to stay competitive and aggressive in 2026, would you prioritize keeping veteran stability on the offensive line, or would you be willing to move on from a respected player like Glasgow to create room for something bigger? If you lean toward keeping veteran stability, you're betting on continuity. You're betting that even with cap pressure, keeping experienced voices in the locker room and meeting room is worth more than squeezing out an extra $5 or $6 million in flexibility. But if you're willing to move on from Glasgow, then you're signaling something else entirely. You're signaling that this front office is prepared to get younger, possibly cheaper, and maybe even more aggressive in reshaping the identity of the offensive line. And that brings us back to the bigger strategy here. The Lions are projected to be over a cap that's expected to fall between $301 and $306 million. That doesn't mean panic. It means precision. Teams deal with this every year. The key is how you balance competitiveness now with sustainability later. Brad Holmes has consistently shown he's not reckless, he's methodical, he values draft capital, he values internal development. So when we talk about cap casualties, it's not about blowing things up. It's about calculated adjustments. Take Taylor Decker again for a moment. A 10% likelihood of being a cap casualty tells you everything. Yes, cutting him would free up over $11.6 million. But you'd also absorb over $9.4 million in dead cap. That's not clean flexibility. And considering he's still providing above average to good play at left tackle, that's a position you don't casually disrupt. Left tackles aren't easy to replace. Stability there protects your entire offense. The only true variable in his situation is his own career decision. If he retires, that's one thing, but a proactive release feels highly unlikely. Now contrast that with Glasgow's 70% likelihood. The difference in tone is clear. Glasgow's cap hit, relative to his projected role, is the issue. Paying over $4 million for a player who may no longer be a full-time starter becomes difficult to justify when you're trimming margins. His versatility still holds value, but versatility at 34 years old comes with a ceiling. If the Lions truly are considering an offensive line overhaul, that could signal a philosophical shift toward youth and long-term cost control. Then you have David Montgomery. At just a 5% likelihood of being a cap casualty, his situation feels more like smoke than fire right now. Yes, Brad Holmes openly discussed the possibility of finding the right situation for him if Detroit can't maximize his skill set. That honesty created headlines, but actions matter more than words. The Lions have been publicly supportive. The addition of offensive coordinator Drew Petzing seems to have reset the tone. Montgomery himself sounded reassured, even energized, after conversations about his role. That doesn't sound like a player on the way out. And let's not overlook the financial mechanics. Cutting Montgomery would only create about $3.5 million in cap space, while leaving nearly $4.9 million in dead money. That's not an efficient move unless there's a bigger strategic reason behind it. The trade market is also uncertain. A 29-year-old running back carrying a $6 million cap hit for an acquiring team, ranking 19th among running backs in 2026, doesn't exactly scream high demand. So unless something unexpected develops, the logical outcome is that he remains part of this offense. The reality is, the Lions don't have many painless exits. Sam Laporta, Brian Branch, and Jack Fox technically could create more than $2 million in savings each, but those options aren't realistic. They're foundational pieces or key contributors. That's why they aren't even part of the serious discussion. Josh Paschal is more of a wait-and-see situation. With a cap hit of just under $176 million and no guaranteed money, there's no rush. Detroit can bring him into training camp, evaluate his health and performance, and make a decision later. Even if he doesn't make the team, the financial impact is minimal. So what does all of this really tell us? It tells us that most of Detroit's cap compliance will likely come from restructures, not dramatic cuts. It tells us that if a notable name does move on, Glasgow is the most logical candidate. It tells us that Taylor Decker's future depends more on his own career decision than the team's desire to move on. and it tells us that the David Montgomery trade buzz may not translate into action. This isn't about tearing down, it's about fine-tuning. The Lions are in a competitive window. You don't destabilize that window unless you absolutely have to. The cap forces tough conversations, but it doesn't automatically force drastic decisions. Now it comes down to timing. March 11th is the deadline marker. Between now and then, every move will signal how aggressive Dietrich plans to be heading into 2026. Will they lean heavily on restructures and keep the core intact? Or will they surprise us with a bold decision to create flexibility for something bigger? Drop your thoughts below. Do you believe Glasgow is the right move if a cap casualty has to happen? Or would you handle this situation differently? And if you think there's a surprise move coming, who do you think it involves? And there's another layer to this that we haven't fully unpacked yet, and that's how these potential decisions reflect the philosophy of this front office moving forward. When you evaluate cap casualties, it's easy to focus purely on numbers. 5 million saved here, 11 million saved there, but the Lions aren't operating in a vacuum. Every dollar moved or saved connects directly to roster construction, depth planning, and future extensions. If Detroit restructures heavily instead of cutting veterans, that often pushes money into future years. That keeps the current roster strong, but it tightens future flexibility. So the balance becomes critical. If Glasgow is released, that's not just about saving $5.56 million. That's a signal that the organization is comfortable shifting responsibility to younger linemen. It suggests confidence in internal development. It also suggests they believe the offensive line can maintain its standard without leaning on a 34-year-old veteran as a safety net. That's not a small bet. If he stays, especially at his current number, then the message changes. That would indicate Detroit values experience and protection against uncertainty more than immediate cap relief. It would show they aren't fully ready to commit to a transition along the interior line. Now look at Taylor Decker through that same lens. If he returns and plays out the season, the Lions are prioritizing stability at the most important offensive line position that protects everything else. It protects the quarterback, it stabilizes the run game, it allows younger linemen to develop without chaos next to them. But if retirement happens, that forces a much larger pivot than a simple cap adjustment. That becomes a structural change. And that's why his situation carries such weight even though the likelihood of a cut is only 10%. It's not about whether the team wants to move on. It's about whether circumstances push them into a new era on the left side of the line. Then there's David Montgomery. His situation is fascinating because it's not purely financial, it's philosophical. When Brad Holmes publicly acknowledges that a player deserves to have his skill set fully utilized, that's transparency. It also reveals how much this front office values fit and role clarity. If Montgomery remains in Detroit and is featured more prominently under Drew Petzing, that tells us the coaching staff and front office are aligned in maximizing personnel. If he were traded, it would signal a strategic reshaping of the backfield dynamic. But cutting him purely for $3, $5 million in savings doesn't feel aligned with how this team operates. The dead cap hit of nearly $4.86 million makes it inefficient.